Practice, practice, practice. Let's practice. I want to point a lot of things out with today's practice problems with adding with rational numbers. So, for example, add and write the fractions in simplest form. That's always a given, guys. You're always going to be asked to write your fractions for the most part in simplest form, so get used to it. So let's go ahead and start with this first one. So 6 plus, and here's where it gets a little bit complicated. I have a negative 4 3/4 plus a negative 2 1/8. Now, since you technically right now have three different things being added together, as long as you keep these negative signs in front, you can add any of these in any order. Addition is commutative. So what I'm actually going to do, for me it'd be easier to just add my negatives first. So I'm just going to take care of this first. And I can do this because I'm keeping this sign in front. So right now I can say I have a negative 4 3/4 plus a negative 2 1/8. Now really what's happening is when I add two negatives, I know my answer will be negative, so I know my answer will be negative, and then I can add like normal. So now I can add 4 3/4 plus 2 1/8 without having to worry about my negative signs. I already took care of that. Now, are these common denominators? No. And can I add together mixed numbers? Yes. All I have to make sure is there's common denominators. So a common denominator between 4 and 8 is 8, so I can simply create an equivalent fraction, multiply bottom and the top by 2. So this will now turn into 4 and 6/8 plus, remember I'm adding these together now, plus 2 1/8. So if I go to add these together, I can add, I always like to start with the fractions first in case it is bigger and I need to then add more wholes. But so 6 plus 1 is 7, so my fraction is going to be 7/8. 4 plus 2 is 6, so my answer is going to be 6 7/8, but a negative 6 7/8, and this is already in simplest form. Now, the last thing I actually have to do here, remember, is add this 6. So now I have a negative 6 7/8. But I still have this positive 6. So what I am going to do is actually, and that's super small. I'm just wanting to erase this box I just put around it. You can technically either say a negative 6 7/8 plus 6, or it's the same thing as just saying 6 minus 6 7/8. So I think that will be more simple. So I'm going to do that. So I'm going to put my 6, I still have this 6, I'm going to bring that down here and say, okay, what is 6 minus 6 7/8? Well, 6 minus 6 is 0, so I'm left with, if I have 0 minus 7/8, that's a negative 7/8. You can also use the trick and say, you turn it into find the difference. So 6 7/8 minus 6 gives you 7/8, and then you always take the sign of the larger one. So I could have done stay, change, change, and done this problem. No matter which method you choose, you should have ended up with a negative 7/8. Here, let's see. So I have a negative negative 5 2/3 plus 3 1/4. Plus a negative 7 1/3. And again, it doesn't really matter what order as long as you keep the sign in front. So we can just start and go left to right. So a negative 5 2/3 plus 3 1/4. What I can do here is when I'm adding with a positive and a negative, I turn it into a subtraction problem and I take the sign of the larger one. So 5 2/3, 5 is larger than 3 1/4, so my answer will be negative. And now I turn it into a subtraction problem of 5 2/3 minus 3 1/4. Again, I need common denominators, so 3, 6, 9, 12. The closest one will have to be 12. So I change both of those into common denominators and I rewrite. So now this becomes 5 8/12 minus 3 3/12. 8 minus 3 is 5/12. 5 minus 3 is 2. So the answer to this part is a negative 2 and 5/12. My last step is I have to bring down what's left. So then plus, this is saying a negative 7 1/3. So a negative plus a negative, I know my answer is going to be negative. Now I can add like normal. 2 and 5/12 plus 7 1/3. I want to create common denominators. So I know that 3, I can get 3 into 12. So if I multiply both that top and bottom by 4, this becomes 2 and 5/12 plus, this is now 7 and 4/12. And remember, I'm ignoring these two negatives right now because I already did that work with my negatives. A negative plus a negative is right here a negative, and then I just add them together. So I'm adding 2 and 5/12 plus 7 and 4/12. 5 plus 4, I know I'll have 9/12. 7 plus 2 is 9. So my answer is a negative 9 and 9/12. And can I simplify this? Yes. So I know my answer will be a negative 9. And both of these are divisible by 3. So I get a negative 9 and 3/4. That is my answer. Last one, working with decimals. Again, you can go in any order, so I'll just start. What is 10.9 plus a negative 15.6? So one thing I can do here, I'll take the sign. I know that both of these will produce a negative since a negative 15.6 has a greater absolute value. So then that becomes, once I worry about that, I can now subtract. So 15.6, I want to find the difference, minus 10.9. And this too, you guys, for these little parts, I know some of you might be wanting to use a calculator. I would just not, for the sake of this video. We're just going to go pretty quickly, and so but I encourage you for a lot of the times just use it. So this difference would be 4 if I subtract 4.7, but like I already pointed out, it's negative, so it's negative 4.7, and then I bring down the rest of what I have, plus 2.1. So again, I have an addition problem with a negative and a positive, so whenever that happens, I take the sign of the larger value, so I know that that will be negative, the larger absolute value, and then I turn it into a subtraction problem because I want to find that difference. So then I do 4.7 minus 2.1, which becomes 6, and then 0 and 2. So then a negative 4.7 plus a 2.1 is really a negative 2.6. So there are all three of your answers. It's a word problem that I think you guys could do. Let's sort of break it down. We're dealing with hot dogs. Any hot dog lovers out there? I know one of my best friends, Haley, is obsessed with hot dogs. Shout out to my friend Haley. So hot dogs, if you eat 3/10 of a pack of hot dogs, your friend eats 1/5 of the pack of hot dogs. What fraction of the pack of hot dogs do you and your friend eat? So all this really wants you to do is, what fraction of the hot dogs do you and your friend eat? Well, picture right now, if this represented sort of the one whole pack of hot dogs, that was your one whole, you eat 3/10. So I would have to break this into tenths, and let's say 3/10 would be about right here. And your friend eats 1/5 of the pack of hot dogs. So they eat 1/5 of this pack of hot dogs. So you have to add on, well, 3/10 plus, let's say from here to here is that 1/5. What fraction of the pack of hot dogs do you and your friend eat? So you're going to have to use some addition here. I want to add together, well, what is 3/10 plus 1/5? Have to find common denominators. So 3/10 plus 2/10 is going to give you 5/10, which I know is equal to 1/2. So you would say that you guys eat together 1/2 of the hot dogs. Yum. Evaluate the expression for when x is 1/3 and y is negative and 7/4. So I plug my values in and I evaluate. So for this first example, I have x plus y. Well, x is really 1/3 plus, I am plugging in a negative 7/4. Now, it depends on what you want to do. Some people like to do common denominators first. Some people like to get their operations out of the way first. It does not matter. So let's say I wanted to get common denominators first. Well, I can multiply here by 4, here by 4, here I would multiply here by 3, here by 3. That should be nothing new. So I get 4/12 plus a negative 21/12. So now I can say what is 4/12 plus a negative 21/12. This is the same thing as 4 minus 21/12, since I have common denominators. So then 4 minus 21, it depends how you want to do that. You can always do stay, change, change. So I think, okay, my answer is going to obviously be a negative because 21 is greater than 4. And then what is 21 minus 4? 17/12. And so my answer is a negative 17/12. Remember, your negative can go on top, it can go on the bottom, it could even go right here on the side. As long as you have the negative there, you're good to go. For 16, I have 3 is being multiplied by 1/3 plus I have a negative 7/4. Now the thing about if I multiply 3 by 1/3, the 3's just cancel out. So this just becomes 1. So this is 1 plus a negative 7/4. And so I can take the sign of the larger one. I can put these both actually first into common denominators. So if I wanted to put, let's say, use this and make this into a mixed number, since I have a whole number here, this would be 1 plus 4 goes into 7. This is negative 1 whole time with 3 left over. So that's 1 3/4. So I want to think, okay, what is 1 plus a negative 1 3/4? Well, 1 plus a negative 1 is just 0. So I'm left with 3/4. So my answer would just be 3/4. And then here for number 17, I have a negative. So when there's a negative here, this is telling me that it's a negative whatever I have in my parentheses. So what could be tricky is, let's pretend for a second that x equaled a negative 1/3. Well, if I wanted to plug in a negative 1/3 into a negative x, that would actually be a negative, and then inside would be a negative 1/3. And a negative times a negative would just give me a positive 1/3. But that's just an example of something that you might see later. Right now, a negative x is a negative 1/3 plus, now this says the absolute value of y. So if the absolute value is, remember, always positive, it's distance. So even though this is a negative, I'm plugging in y as a negative 7/4. It's in absolute value. So now let's simplify. This in absolute value is really 7/4. And then this is going to multiply, it's referring to this 1/3, so I have a negative 1/3 plus 7/4, step by step. So my last thing I can do is say, oh, I can flip this around. This is really the same thing as 7/4 minus 1/3. Last step, I can find common denominators. I already know what these are. When I find common denominators, this would be a minus, this is 4/12. And then 7/4. 7/4 is the same thing as negative, or I'm sorry, just 21/12. So 21 minus 4 equals 17/12, and that would be my answer. All right, let's go ahead and take a little error here. So just by observing, a negative plus a negative is a negative, okay. But since I already took care of those negatives, I still want to add together this negative. Remember, adding two negatives together is going to be a bigger negative. So the error here is 7 plus, well, actually, first, they need to line up their decimals. So my answer is going to be negative, but their decimals are not lined up, and it looks like they subtracted. So set 3.7, and then I want to put my decimal here, and put, here's 2, 5, and then I'll have, here's my 0 in my ones place. So I know that my answer, a negative plus a negative is a negative, and then I add it together. So this would be 5. 7 plus 2 is 9. Carry down my decimal, and I get 3. So together, my answer should be a negative 3.95. So the mistake here looks like they subtracted and their decimals were not aligned. Here, let's see. I have a negative 5/8 plus 1/8. And they turned this into, okay, yes, common denominator. So then a negative 5 plus 1 over 8. So that's correct. However, here they have a negative 6. So here's their error. Is negative 5 plus 1, what is that? That's like saying 1 minus 5, which is negative 4. Or you can think, I'll take the larger absolute value, which is negative, subtract 5 minus 1 is 4. So your answer should really be a negative 4/8, which is equal to a negative 1/2.